Camera's live in 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. While we settle in and gather and participants start coming into our Zoom room, I'm asking that the audience respond to a question with one word. And if you wouldn't mind typing your answer into the chat while everybody arrives, I would really appreciate it. And the question I'd love for you to respond to is, how would you describe your relationship to nature right now? So we've got people coming in. Complicated. Okay. And as you share your comments into the chat, I'd like to just welcome you all here. And thank you for joining us for this forecast discussion. What will our view of nature bring to the future? But before we get into the discussion, which is going to be a pretty vibrant one with this panel, we've been asked to give an audio description of ourselves. And maybe when we do that, each of our panelists can tell us where they are, because I think we might win the sort of global participation for the whole forecast series, and I'm hoping that's true. And so I'll start, and then I will ask each of our speakers to do the same. My name is Jessica Sweden, and I'm wearing a sort of teal green top, and I'm surrounded by plants sitting in a conservatory in London. Danny, can you go next, please?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name's Danny Celermajer, and my immediate surroundings are a light blue room, and I'm wrapped in a blue and brown Nepali shawl. But outside, I'm surrounded by the rainforest on Dharawal land, the unceded lands and waters of the Dharawal people of the Yuin Nation, otherwise known as the southeast of Australia, up in a high rainforest. Lovely to be here with you.
Asmin, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Usman. I'm sitting in here in quite a nondescript room because I've been stuck away from home for 5 months trying to get back to London, where I live. I'm in Singapore, which is lovely at the moment, but in a very anonymous space.
Thank you. Milka?
Hi everyone, my name is Milka Chepkorir. I am seated in my living room on a red couch, maroon couch, and wrapped in a black shawl and in glasses. Yeah, maybe take this chance to say what my relationship with nature is now. Is very
well. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get there in a minute. I just wanted to do this first introduction. Thank you. Okay, Iain, over to you.
Well, I'm an elderly bloke with a beard, and I'm wearing a green jacket, and I'm sitting in the library of my house on the Isle of Skye in the Hebrides, looking across the water to Uist, surrounded by cliffs and mountains and waterfalls.
Lovely. Okay, now we've dreamed ourselves into all these wonderful places on Earth, which is a wonderful start to this discussion. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Just to give you a little bit of background on me before we get started. I'm the co-founder of Synchronicity Earth, an environmental charity that works to address the challenges in global conservation. We work in the gaps, very much around where the loss of biodiversity is the most pronounced, and are guided by both science and local communities and indigenous wisdom. I'm also the co-founder of Flourishing Diversity, one of the partners in the Forecast series. Flourishing Diversity is both a vision and a practice. We're celebrating and calling urgent attention to the interconnection in cultural and biological diversity. With that, it should come as no surprise that I'm very excited about this discussion. With us today, we have 4 exceptional people. It feels like a gift. As I said to Iain earlier, I feel like a kid in a candy shop, and he told me he was quite happy to be the coconut candy, which I then told him was my favorite candy bar, so we're in good shape. I just only wish we were meeting in person around a table and that we had all the time in the world. Forecast program is focused on the future and what influences how we think about it. For this panel, how our relationship with nature will shape our future is key. This discussion will explore the relationships that humans have with nature, a relationship that many see as broken and at the root of some of our greatest problems. The fact of the matter is, we're in an ecological crisis. To paraphrase a friend who I think is joining us this afternoon, not only are we destroying non-human life at ever higher rates, but many of us find ourselves further and further removed from the consequences of our actions. We're either distracted or numb to the loss, and yet we exist in a paradox. We've also never been more connected to others, as is indicated in the fact that we're all speaking to each other today. We're more connected to other cultures, and we're also more connected to other ways of living. We're going to start by posing the same question to each of our speakers to start the discussion, and each one will answer in about 3 minutes. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion for the next sort of half an hour or so, and then we'll move on to audience questions. So please, as you very diligently put your feelings into the chat, please also think about questions as we go and use the Q&A function for those. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start with Iain McGilchrist, a psychiatrist, a scholar in literature, philosophy, and neuroscience, author of many texts, most notably including The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain, and the Making of the Western World. Iain, how will our relationship with nature shape our future?
It will probably be the most important thing in our future. And I say thing in inverted commas, because I've just written a book called The Matter with Things, which will come out, I hope, in a couple of months. And that's a pun on the way in which we get the world wrong. We think it's just matter and we think it's made up of things. But I argue in the book that relationships are prior to the things that are related, which may sound strange to Western ears. But what we are experiencing in the world is relationships, not just entities that are out there. And this is a consequence of the rise of a certain way of thinking, which I associate with the left hemisphere of the brain, which tends to have fragmentary vision in order to grasp things and use them. Whereas the right hemisphere has a vigilant, sustained attention to the world in order to understand it as a whole. And I think that our civilization has got into a strange way of thinking about the world, in which we think there's a lot of bits out there that we can use and we can put together in whatever way we like. But this is not the case. We are nature. Nature is us. We come out of nature, we go back into nature, and we are nature through and through. It is not the environment. The environment is something you might have a department of, and indeed we do, but it's not around us somewhere out there. Nature is in us, in here. And I love the word nature, partly because it was much used in a very beautiful way by my favorite poet, Wordsworth, but because it talks of something that is always being born. That's what nature means. And that is a lovely idea compared with the idea of an environment. So if we don't actually get our relationship with one another, with the cosmos and with nature right, we're doomed as a civilization. And we seem to be accelerating fast into this abyss.
Ooh, thank you very much. I had a sneaky feeling you might talk a little bit about that dualistic part of our brain. Okay. Danny Celermajer, professor of sociology and social policy at the University of Sydney, also one of Forecast series partners, and the lead of the Multi-Species Justice Project. Danny has a background in human rights and is the author of Summertime Reflections on a Vanishing Future. How will our relationship with nature shape our future?
So I suspect, and it's somewhat confirmed looking at the answers that people gave to that initial question that you asked, Jessica, that there's going to be pretty broad agreement to that question. That the way I think of it is that so long as humans' relationship with nature, and that separation is already problematic, but so long as that relationship is organised according to what I think of as these twin pathologies of extractivism, that it's all stuff for us to use, and exceptionalism, that we're somehow floating above it, then the possibility of a future fit for the myriad forms of life that make up this earth home, including us, are going to erode. On the other hand, as Iain said, if we can appreciate that we are infused with this otherness that we call nature, and that nature is infused with us, then I think a different type of future which could support life is still possible. So for me, the question is not so much what that relationship needs to look like, but how we get there. And so I thought that I might do show, not tell, and with a little story. So in December of 2019, as the fires that became known as the Black Summer fires started to approach the multi-species community in which I live, we started to evacuate the animals. And two of the animals who we evacuated were two pigs, Katie and Jimmy. Tragically, we evacuated them about 4 hours south of here, and 2 days later, that land was surrounded on 3 sides, and there was a conflagration, and Katie was burnt to death. About a week later, we managed to bring Jimmy home, and I found myself face to face with a being whose world had been ruptured in the most radical manner, and called to care for, but also to witness what he did in this state. And I just want to read a little passage from that time. I went and sat alone just down the slope from where Jimmy has been lying. It's way down in the bush over a gully. The light is soft. You can hear the birds and the wind moving through the trees. The air and the earth are cool, and the smell is of leaves and the river. I cannot presume to know what he is doing when he lies there, but it seems to me that he is taking himself back to an ecology not wrought by the terror of the fires, nor fueled by our violence on the earth. He is letting another earth heal him. When people speak about the fires, they often speak about being overwhelmed by the enormity of the devastation. We do not really have the capacity to grasp this much loss, not only to humans, but to the other wild and domestic animals, to the bush, to the ecologies of rivers and moss and the creatures who flourish there, to the possibility of regeneration. I know I don't, but I can hold Jimmy's enormous grieving head in my arms and be present to the gravity and finality of this loss, and at the same time to his broken and miraculous presence. So he gave me the best answer that I've learned.
Thank you. That I think we need to have a pause after that. Thank you for sharing that, Danny. And I think loss is something that we will probably touch upon a bit more as we go. For sure, we have to move from this into something else, but we also have to acknowledge where we are. And I think that's really essential in where we are as human beings right now. So Milka Chepkuria, an advocate for indigenous land rights from the Sengwer community in Kenya. Milka has degrees in anthropology and in anthropology and also in gender and development studies, which is another thing I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about later. She's a human rights activist and is passionate about the rights of women and children. How will our relationship to with nature shape our future, Milka?
It definitely plays a big role, you know, in shaping our future. But now I think to me it depends who our relationship, who are you, you know? We have different subsets in the society. There are people who are like purely individualistic and just think about themselves, and that leads to how much they want to get out of this so-called nature that we really as indigenous communities do not see as different from who we are. We are nature and nature is us, because there's really no line to draw, you know. We depend on whatever is around us as well as it depends on us. So as I was saying, it depends on who our relationship with nature is, because in the case of indigenous communities, I belong to the Sengwer indigenous community, by the way, nature and us is one, and we treat everything around us just like any other human being, you know, and we believe that they have souls, they have spirits, they have this. And we also believe that when you do anything harmful, it will haunt you. And this is why many indigenous communities around the world, including my own community, is fighting to remain in their own ancestral territories and be able to live in harmony, just like it has been for years. But you know, the other thought that comes against that, and that leads to many cases of evictions and human rights violation, is the thought of, no, you have to remove human beings from nature, you know, and it beats the logic, because then, as we know, there's no separation between these two. And these communities have been living in nature, in these environments, ever since, and they've been conserved. It's only when the very individualistic thought comes to people and therefore want just to exploit from it, and now want to draw that line and say, no, now we have to go out there to nature and bring things. And it gives power to those who can get out and bring more, and deprive nature the rights of being itself. And that is why it will swallow us as human beings if we continue doing the same thing, because we depend on it for survival, and it depends on us for survival, just like human beings depend on each other. So I think it's just time for people to realize that there's no difference, and there's no way we are going to still think that we need to get things out of nature to ourselves, because we are still nature. And if that is realized, then we know this symbiotic relationship that we have with everything and everyone on earth. And if we respect that, then our future becomes great. If we continue thinking the way we are thinking, then we are perishing, and the future becomes dark. So that's how I think that is related.
So we have a lot of work to do. I think we'll be touching a lot on that as well. Again, time's going to be an issue here. So I'm going to move over to Usman. Usman Haque, who's a trained artist, architect, and creative director at Umbrellium, which specializes in the design and research of interactive architecture systems. They believe that architecture is no longer considered something static and immutable. Instead, it is seen as dynamic, responsive, and conversant. And this sounds like a way forward to me. So Usman, how will our relationship with nature shape our future?
Well, I think, so picking up on a number of things that the others have said, I think us having a future relies on us removing that distinction. You know, I think that for us to have a future, we almost no longer need, you know, when we no longer consider nature as something separate, or even a separate category, that will be because we have actually worked out a future of ourselves. We've kind of persisted in pretending that that there is this kind of exotic other, which is nature, and it's had consequences on how we design our physical environments, on how we design our technologies, on our economic systems, on our health infrastructure, everything. And so when we've managed to transform that relationship, which I think all of us are trying to be optimistic about being able to do, the future will be radically changed because it will affect the environmental infrastructure, the technological infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, social, the health infrastructure, and everything. Now, necessarily, that process is an incredibly complex one. And the big question arises, who decides? Who decides at each individual moment, whether it's us humans or whether it's non-humans? How can they be part, actually, of the whole deliberation process? That, I think that this is a really interesting question for me, because unless we are all part of a very diverse, and by which I mean diverse in the cultural sense as well as biodiverse transformation, the future itself just will not materialize, at least not for us humans. I mean, I'm pretty sure the non-humans will work out a way to continue. So for me, the kind of key indicator that we're getting there, because I'm always trying to think, how would I even know when we're in the right direction? Basically is when my relationship to house mice and cockroaches and geckos is transformed, right? I still see them as a little bit like, they're in my space. But actually, if you think about it from a practical sense, these are other organisms sharing the same air quality, sharing the same food, sharing the same toxins, and to a certain extent experiencing the same physical environment. And I think, if we get to a point where we actually understand that there are flatmates, that is a good indicator to me that we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you. Right. Okay. So I'm starting to feel like we need to unpack sort of what maybe a consciousness shift here. So there's we have to bridge this divide in order to become more comfortable and also to become more accepting of the cockroaches and our more than human species that we coexist with, and beyond into other cultures, as you say, Osman. So I guess for me, part of the problem is we know that carbon emissions are at an all-time high. We know that the rates of extinction are at an all-time high, and we're becoming more focused on the technical and sort of structural aspects of the ecological crisis. Things like net zero. This is all languaging that is also really interesting and important and probably part of the problem, in my opinion. But for me, the big question is, will we be able to reverse the ecological crisis if we can't really shift our consciousness? And so I'd love to unpack that a little bit more. And maybe as you each answer, you can tell us a little bit more about how some of your work is really helping to try to shift consciousness, but also, maybe draw upon some of the assumptions and paradigms that you're breaking down, and what are you, tell us what you're replacing them with. So, Milka, you're nodding a lot, so I feel like I should call on you first. You seem to be in this question.
Yeah, why I'm nodding is because I listen to you, and I know that you come from you come from a place where you're imagining that people have lost their consciousness, which is the situation actually that most people
Good point.
have. But yeah, I will tell you from the indigenous life, indigenous communities' way of life. We would say that what we are doing as communities is to fight to maintain our consciousness.
Yes.
It's not like we have lost it. It is there, but the forces of those ones who have lost their consciousness on how they see the same thing is so great that we cannot be able to fight that much, and this will just take us back to know how conservation strategies are being modeled in the world. And you realize that most of the countries, I would speak about Kenya and most of the the southern countries have adopted fortress conservation, which is primarily built on these very distinction of human beings and nature, so that they imagine that there's no one who can live in a protected area, in a declared forest reserve or a declared place with rich biodiversity, with no regard being given to know the fact that these people have been living in this kind of an environment all this time, and they've lived together with whatever other non-human species, for the longest time. And so you realize that the force that is coming from the others is kind of pushing all the indigenous communities and all the others that still have their consciousness to the line that the others followed, to losing their consciousness, and yeah,
you're protecting, basically. Yeah.
So I think
you're protecting yourself from the dominant culture, which is trying to get rid of a consciousness.
Yeah, so I think it's time for people to realize that we have a little spot where consciousness is still with people, which is the indigenous community, and therefore then work with spreading it out to the people who have lost their consciousness, and realize that actually we are not different from nature and we can work our way back. Otherwise, I think we will all end up to the same direction and we will crash this. As Osman is saying, I think other species will survive. But we are so evil that if we continue this way, we will just perish and the earth will continue anyway.
Well, thank you, Milka, for helping us maintain that kernel of consciousness. Maybe Iain, you can jump in here with some thoughts about how you think we might need to shift our Western dominant consciousness. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right to say that it won't help unless we change the way we think, what Milka's been referring to as consciousness. It's often been pointed out that we won't be able to get ourselves out of this mess by the same thinking that got us into it. And even if we were able to stop felling rainforests, if we did so only because we realized somehow that there were going to be economic consequences for the whole world if we didn't, then we would be thinking in the wrong way. We were already, that gets us no further forward, except that we're sort of thinking in this reductionist way about something that we can use, material resource that we can grab. And what I think Milka refers to as consciousness is really a balanced position between the hemispheres of the brain, in which the left hemisphere no longer dominates. The left hemisphere is something that has evolved for us to enable us to use the world. So it has a place. We won't manage to save the planet, or actually it's not saving the planet at all, as we're all agreed it's saving mankind, not the planet. The planet will look after itself. But we need to do that as a whole with a consciousness of how the world and ourselves are one, effectively. So I think this involves education. I think it involves not just education at school, but education of the general mindset in the West, which has become obsessed with things, material goods, and getting them, and not with relationships. I often think the idea that we can understand things by taking them apart is a very bad one for applying to anything real. I mean, anything that naturally exists. The parts are constructed by our minds. There are no parts in nature. There are wholes that are nested. Each thing that looks like a part is a whole in relation to something else, and everything that looks like a whole is a part of a bigger whole. So we have to stop thinking that we understand things by taking them apart. I often use the analogy of music. If you tried to work out what music was, you'd end up with single notes which mean absolutely nothing, but when they're all put together in their relationships, they mean everything. And that is the analogy for how we must change our relationship with the world and how we can, if you like, get ourselves out of this mess. And I'll just answer very briefly the question which you posed of in what way does my work help towards this. I don't know necessarily that it does, but if it does, the evidence I have is from people who constantly write to me saying, after reading your book, I realize I've been looking at things in a very strange way all my life, and I knew this other way, but I had no language to talk about it. I had no way of describing it, expressing it, and you have articulated this other vision of the world that I know is deeper, richer, full of meaning, and is actually alive, not a planet that is dead and dying. So all I want to do with the few years I've got left is to raise consciousness in people. And that is what education is, actually. It's drawing out from them what they already know latently at some level.
Oh, thank you. What a gift. Danny, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I want to jump in and responding from what Iain just said. I think, you know, I completely hear what Melka, what you're saying about indigenous lifeways and worldviews and what has been lost. At the same time, I don't think it's been completely lost in the West. You know, disenchantment is something that was really consolidated at the end of the 19th century with the rise of a particular type of urbanization and modernity and industrial capitalism. And as Iain said, you know, when people are reminded or given language or given images that they resonate in this very profound way with something that we still retain, even if it's not written as, you know, the nature of Western culture. I think it's still present. It's still present in our art forms, in our dance, in our literature, in so much of what we love. And so, you know, I'm increasingly thinking that while it's important to be confronted with the threats that we're facing, at the same time, I think as a form of transformative action, it's really critical to be connected to what we love. And even highly urbanized people, even people who have very abstracted and resource-heavy relationships with this otherness that we call nature, there's usually some place that they love. There's some place where they feel that type of oneness and connection. And rather than getting into conversations about climate denialism, which we know don't go anywhere, I think to start from either what Iain was saying about, you know, yes, I've always felt that, or I've always loved that, and then grow out that kernel through artwork, through storytelling, through science. You know, these are all discourses that come together. That's how I think about it. If I can just say one tiny little thing that I wanted to add is that I also think talking about consciousness is really important, but there's a little bit of a danger that it becomes a dualistic conversation, as if what needs to happen is something that's changing up here. And what happens in this place that we call up here, I'm pointing to my head, is as if we're not embodied beings, and we're completely embodied beings, and how we think about the world, how we understand the world is shaped by the life ways that we occupy. Who do I hang out with? Who do I love? Who do I bump into? What does the space that I occupy look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? So I think we can't just have a conversation about consciousness as if we're these kind of disembodied beings. We also have to have a conversation about how we, and this is Usman's stuff, so maybe hand over to him, how do we design our world?
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree fully. It's just trying to sort of realize and stop us and give us that pause to realize, you know, to do exactly what you just said, which is remind us of our human beingness and our love and what connects us through. So yes, Usman, please jump in. I feel like this is a perfect point for you.
Well, so I was nodding vigorously as Danielle was talking, because I think, you know, as somebody who's worked both at a kind of neighborhood scale as well as mass participation global scale, one of the things I've noticed is it's phenomenally difficult to even think about transforming people's consciousness. And even if I thought I could do that and thought I had the right idea what that transformation should be, it would be wrong inherently, because I should not be the one who has somehow, figured out the secret to the world and then just sort of imparting it on others. And so actually kind of grappling with this question of consciousness, I think becomes most important kind of at the level of cultural consciousness, not just in the individual, but how do we all think and live together, with everything around us. And I think that the pandemic has, there's very little good news in the pandemic. However, it has transformed, I think, globally, our understanding of our interactions, our interdependence, our kind of mutualism, if you like. I mean, this is not universal, but certainly has had an effect, at least on a debate, at that kind of level. And what it has raised for me is this question of prisoner's dilemma, which is that, I think that like others have alluded to, I think, a lot of people, possibly even the majority of people, already have this consciousness that embraces a somewhat holistic approach. But we've kind of replaced the prisoner's dilemma of mutually assured destruction in the 70s with the prisoner's dilemma of environmental action, which is that I could do all sorts of things to help improve the environment, but I don't believe that my neighbor is going to. So why should I, X, Y, Z? Why should I, as this country, take an economic penalty when I know that another country is not going to do the same thing and they're going to sort of, leap ahead? And so I actually think that the challenge for me is not so much the consciousness, but it is the trust and the broken trust and the kind of the embracing of the perspective of the other, whether that is another person, another culture, another country, another species, or what have you. And yeah, I'll leave it there. I've gone on a bit too long, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for me, the where you're going with this, Esmond, and this idea of the other, and some of the work we're doing with flourishing diversity, which is really about this intersection between cultural and biological diversity, and the fact that we sort of know that 80% of intact biodiversity exists within local communities and indigenous communities, which to this panel would not be surprising. But then if you think about sort of in the West or in my culture, there's this kind of fear of other culture. But whereas, what's so interesting to me in that is that by embracing other cultures, we actually improve our chances of survival. You start to realize that actually in the full payload of possibilities that exist within all of these different cultures, we actually have all the answers we need. We just are struggling to get there. And so maybe we can talk a little bit more about, unpack that, like how do we transition into that? What are the actions that we need to take? How do we become more accepting? Are there things that we can do? I mean, Esmond, obviously in your work, maybe you can talk a little bit more about your urban rewilding work that you're doing. That's, I believe, the sort of participatory aspect, but maybe some others can jump in as well with ideas about how do we move forward? How do we open up our hearts? And maybe Danny as well, thinking about some of the things around, this book, which I can't wait to get my hands on, your new book, about, this idea of responsibility, how to, and recreating some of that trust. How do, what are people thinking about this? Who wants to start?
Well, I think I think the point about trust is a very valuable one indeed. Societies simply can't exist without trust. And I remember hearing this early Chinese saying that a ruler needs guns, food, and trust. And if he has to do without any one of them, it should be guns first and food next. but no society can exist without trust. And we're very low in trust. We're also very low in humility and awe. When the question was asked, what is one's relationship with nature in one word? Mine is awe. And I think that's part of what's missing in our lives, is a sense of wonder at the incredible intelligence of nature that we really aren't even beginning to get to grips with. We think we're so clever, but we're just modeling it in a sort of mechanical way. But if we don't have some kind of compassion for the world, for one another, for nature, some sort of awe before existence, and nature is part of that, and some humility about us, I don't think we will get very far forward. It's no good blaming one person in one culture, blaming another culture. It's time we pull together, and we all have strengths and values that we can use. There's no culture that doesn't. One thing that I think, though, is rather sad is that modern Western culture is dominating so rapidly over cultures from which we could have learned, but they're westernizing themselves so fast that some of that wisdom and knowledge is lost.
Who wants to respond? Esmond, do you want to tell us?
I just wanted to connect what Iain said about wonder and awe with something that you said earlier, Jessica, about loss. And I think that we often place these emotions of loss and grief and joy and love and wonder as in tension with each other. But we are in this moment of tremendous loss. You know, the climate catastrophe and extinction is not the future abstract, it's the present concrete. And so rather than shunning loss and grief and mourning, I think being with each other, not in an individual way, but collectively strengthening our capacities to be present to the reality of loss, I think is one of the most powerful ways through to wonder and to love. And so many cultures know this. So many ancient cultures have these practices of lamentation and collective mourning that both rebuild community structures and fabrics that get torn apart through crisis, and at the same time reconnect with what we love. So I think there's something about recomplexifying that emotional territory that we've become so adept at building infrastructures of addiction and avoidance and concrete that shield us from being present to the losses that are occurring. Whereas I would say that being present to them together is actually the way through back to the awe and to the wonder that Iain was talking about.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. Esmond, do you want to talk to us about your participatory work?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm working on a project in East London where I live called Rewild, which is essentially an urban wilding scheme, which is so it's supported by the Eden Project. It's a 10-year project, and so we're still in the early months, so there's not a whole lot of detail. But essentially, you know, we're taking this two-pronged approach, which is partly the transformation of the physical fabric of the city. You know, all the things as Iain referred to them, and I think this is typically what's understood as rewilding, which is the introduction of and in some cases reintroduction of species. But the more important part of this, which is that because it's the thing that actually is the most complex, is the kind of rewilding of people, you know, and actually kind of transforming people's relationship to each other in the city, and so on and so forth, and to kind of non-human systems and what have you, and you know, basically making people a little bit more wild as well, as it were. And so the tactic that I'm taking draws somewhat on the kind of participatory projects before, which is there's these sort of two aspects I think that I've always tried to use. One is to kind of break things down such that, and this is also, by the way, part of trying to crack prisoner's dilemma and turn it into a kind of mutually cooperative process, which is, first of all, try and find ways to break things down so that people who are early to a project can take a first step that others can see. So this is not just about being educated, but it's actually about doing something that others see you doing something, if you see what I mean. And usually if you can design it, whether it's about beekeeping or whether it's about connecting growing to eating, or whether it's about a chorus of birdsong or what have you, doing something basically that enables somebody to do something they didn't think that they could do, however small that is, and making it visible so that there's some kind of scale effect. And then secondly, kind of connecting a whole bunch of those things together, where people do something together that is more than they would have done on their own, that somehow, again, for scale purposes, achieves a kind of a non-linear output. I'm kind of being technical here, but what I'm really talking about basically is kind of little strategies to get people involved, to get other people involved, to kind of cascade into hopefully a kind of larger phenomena, where at every stage, people will be part of feeding back into the overall goal and trajectory of what we're doing. So that's part of the reason why I don't necessarily have a really clearly articulated statement of intent, because the whole point is we have to develop this collectively and transform it continually.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, but what I love about what you're doing is that you're demonstrating that intention. You're really looking at the sort of like the value of going wide with a governance structure and getting the buy-in from communities, which, of course, on my screen, you're sitting next to Milka, who's on the other end of the spectrum, sort of trying to protect that very type of community that is intact and being evicted from lands at a rapid rate constantly. I think you've had something like 22 evictions over time, and then finds herself, going to, I've heard her speak before quite fiercely about what it was like getting a higher education, and how interesting it was. And I should really let you speak for yourself, Milka. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, going to school to learn what you kind of know already, but in order to be heard, you had to get a degree. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that while I scroll through these questions that are emerging, so we can have a bit of time for the audience.
Yeah, of course, coming from an indigenous community and the force that I said before that comes from, the modern education and the Western way of doing things and fortress conservation has really become a challenge to me and most of my community members who are speaking for our community land rights and speaking against the human rights violations that we are facing in terms of the evictions, because rarely are you really given attention or even your words being considered when you're not educated. Or sometimes you will go to a government official and be like, I am Milka Chepkorir from the indigenous community, and they look at you and be like, but you don't look indigenous, and it's heartbreaking, because I wonder how they view an indigenous person should be like, or maybe they imagine that you should be uneducated, you should be barbaric, you should not be someone who is interacting with them to tell them what it is that we need to do to save the loss of our forests, or to save this so-called nature that we want to protect. And actually, when you asked that question, I was really on the receiving end. Like, I really want to understand why the rest of the world do not get what we are saying as indigenous people. Why don't you get it? Because for us, nature is us and our land and our trees and everything else. And when we are bringing this forward to the government officials and to every other person and telling them, no, this is the way we have been living with our forest, and this is the way we will address climate change issues, this is how we will address conservation issues, and this is how we will address the others, people still don't trust us. you know, and I'm glad that it is being appreciated, that people really don't trust each other. And it's even harder to trust indigenous communities, because there's so much that is attached to people being educated, people having done researches, people having gone through this very formal education, that there's less they think they can learn from indigenous people, you know, and indigenous ways of life. But in real sense, we would, like everybody here will agree, the richest biodiversities and cultural diversities in the world is with the indigenous communities and their territories. Then people should ask themselves, why that? Should it time then to learn from them on how they relate with nature, if people decide to separate it? And therefore, how can we make sure that that spreads to the others, and therefore we can save humanity? The reality, which is a sad reality, is that if at all the planet collapse, it will not choose who an indigenous person is or who another person is. It's humanity. So it's time we listen to each other. It doesn't matter how much you've gone to school. It doesn't matter how much you know about what, but just respect what the other person brings on the table. And as you're saying, Jessie, of course, this is something that I had to struggle with. You know, I just realized that as Sengwer community, we are being disregarded, maybe because people think we haven't gone to school enough. And I had to, you know, just be in that position that they want me to be in so that they can listen. And that's why I went to school to do anthropology particularly, and be a helping professional to my own people, and which I am proud of doing. And sometimes it's just hard to understand why people cannot give a ear or just listen to indigenous communities.
Thank you. Yeah, listening, I think, is a really important attribute that we need to learn more and spend time with. I think also pausing and taking time is important as well. There's a couple, I mean, there's quite a few questions coming in. We've got a few more minutes. I mean, one of them is, there are a couple that are around sort of, you know, sacredness and ritual, and some of the things that you were talking about, Danny. You know, how do we create space in the world that we have right now for lamenting, and what does that look like in the more sort of Western world? Maybe somebody wants to, maybe you want to respond to that, or others might have some ideas about how do we create space out of our busyness for some of these practices that I think that are coming through that we need to embrace.
I might just say that I think that question, if that question is how do we create space and what are the rituals, we will find the rituals by creating the space. and build on what Usman said, you know, this is going to be emergent, it's going to be local. We have resources that we can draw on, you know, these histories of rituals that they've not disappeared, but they're going to be specific to the moment and specific to the communities and the types of losses and loves that they have. And I think it's by attending, you know, I loved what you said, Jessica, about listening, about attending to each other and to not just the humans, of course. We're not the only ones who are experiencing losses. Everyone around us, the trees, the rivers, the animals, the soils are, you know, eroding at a rate where they are also having very different experiences of the losses. But I think it's about stopping and creating the spaces and recognizing that the need for rituals is something that is going to nourish all of us. Out of those processes, they will be emergent, but I don't think it can be a top-down model of this is how you lament, because it has to be more connected than that.
There's yesterday there was a panel specifically about complexity, but it's kind of percolating in some of the questions as well. You know, it's just this sort of fear that we have around complexity. And I, you know, I also have a question around this, you know, sort of about fear, and how do we move through that and be okay with the messiness of the future as it is. And I wonder if any of you want to respond a bit more. Maybe Iain, we've got some ideas about this, but just, how do we embrace the change? How do we not fear the change? And how do we let go of that so that we can move forward? It's all kind of related to what we've been saying, but are there any, I think there's people are looking for sort of tricks and actions, as always. We're sort of trained that way, aren't we? We want solutions. That's what we've been told we are looking for. Does anybody have any, despite the fact that that might be a left brain question?
Well, no, I just say, one of my themes in this, there are a number of them. One is that we need to resacralize the world, but it's also that we're wedded to linear thinking, that here's a target. If we take this step and that step, we will achieve that target. That sounds rational, but there are many things in life that won't be achieved if you do that, including all the most important things, starting with being able to go to sleep and ending up with being wise. If you strive too much towards this target, you won't ever achieve it. So, as you rightly point out, this is a problem of complexity. And in order to understand complex wholes, we need to stop thinking that they are made up of linear stretches. They're not. They have to be appreciated as a whole. It doesn't mean to say that you can't turn a microscope on a certain part of it and intervene in this very, very complex whole. But don't imagine that just because you can do that, the whole system is linear in some way. It isn't. So we need to be able to see a much bigger and broader picture, both further away from where we're situated physically and geographically, and further away in time, both listening to the past and honoring it and projecting a future that our children and grandchildren can live in. So I think this business of a perspective change is very important. And one of the things that would help is if we did find time in our days to be peaceful, reflective, still the monkey mind, which is the left hemisphere constantly having opinions and putting things in boxes and pigeonholes, but instead just be present, we might find something miraculous happens if we listen, as you say. Most of this is about attending and listening, not in some passive way, but in an active way in which you have some idea of what's there and you're calling to it. There's a kind of reverberative connection between you and what it is, not just a passive listening. Listening is an action as well, and a very important one. And if we don't make time in our day to do this, we'll always find lots of little things that will drive it out.
There's another question here, but I'm not sure we're going to have time to answer about economic models and money in the last 45 seconds of this panel. Sorry that we didn't get to answer that one. Maybe we can take it offline and send a response. I came into this panel concerned about time, and one of the things that I feel now, just listening to all of you, is that my heart rate has gone down. I feel really relaxed. I feel very sort of, I'm always a generally optimistic person, but I feel particularly sort of at ease, kind of just spending the time with all of you to sort of really just listen to each of you, but then to also just understand where each of you are coming from. So I'm just, and I hope the audience as well, if I were to ask them all the same question again, but they would, feel maybe a little bit less separate from the natural world than they did when they joined. So thank you very much for being with us today. I really appreciate all of your time and your deep wisdom and your heart, which has come through as well. And clearly you're all very passionate about the work that you do. So thank you so much for being here with us. We've got another wonderful panel coming up in about an hour and a half with Ailton Krenek and Antonio Nobre from Brazil. And it should be another fantastic conversation, which will be picking up on a lot of these same themes. So thank you again to each of you for joining us. Thank you to the audience. Sorry we never get to all the questions, and I appreciate your all being here. Have a lovely afternoon, and good night, Danielle. And Osman, for that matter.